It's now my distinct privilege to welcome our Mickey Milner lecturer and professor today, Dr. Ron Buliung. Dr. Buliung is a full professor in the Department of Geography, Geomatics, and Environment at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. He is also a graduate chair of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. Dr. Buliung has dedicated his entire career to studying the experiences of children and youth in cities, particularly on inequities relating to how children get to school and how their school travel connects and impacts their health. As a parent of a child with a neuromuscular condition, he has increasingly focused on the intersection between disability and ableism and how it permeates all the places we work, live, play, and learn. In fact, this coming year, he will teach a course on disability and the city in the hopes of planting a seed in the minds of urban planners to always view their profession and the built environment from an equity, inclusion, diversity, and accessibility lens. I'm personally looking forward to Dr. Buliung's talk, given the focus of our Dear Everybody campaign this year on challenging ableism. We'll also have some time at the end for questions, so please feel free to send in your questions via the chat box. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Ron Buliung.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction. Just getting my technology set up here. I'd just like to begin by saying how honored I am to be this year's recipient of the Mickey Milner International Professorship in Disability Studies. And before I dive into my talk, I just want to take a moment to thank your staff for keeping us all on track and helping to get today launched. Kathleen O'Brien, Sulan Toy, Jamaica Marazigan. And I'd also like to acknowledge the work of my grad students. Some of that work will be woven into my talk this morning. Students like Tim Ross, who's now a research scientist at Bloorview, and Rhonda Solomon and Naomi Schwartz. So at today's conference, we'll be doing some listening to each other, sharing and unpacking some difficult, messy stories, and perhaps making public private matters that require attention and action. I think it's going to be a challenging and fantastic day. I'm sharing with you in this initial slide a few quotes that link to these themes of listening and sharing, telling of stories. And I do want to attribute the quote by Audre Lorde to author and Professor Ian Williams, who used this quote in his most recent book, Disorientation on Being Black in the World. I wonder, however, if you might indulge me for a moment as I take on a brief and somewhat philosophical exercise. When you look at your conference program, you will notice that I am indeed giving the Mickey Milner International Professorship Lecture. The focus is meant to be childhood disability research. Later today, you've been invited to attend Dr. Temple Grandin's lived experience keynote, I Am What I Do and What I Feel. And this just sounds amazing. I found it curious, though, that these two ideas or concepts, research and lived experience, take up separate places within the program. I came to rest upon a few rather large questions, like what is research? What do we count as research? Who does the counting and why do we count? What do we understand research to be and how do we make it? I wondered too, of course, if there is a moment when lived experience becomes research. Of course there is, and of course it counts. It really just comes down to one's worldview, one's onto-epistemological position at any particular moment in any particular place and time. For example, the dominant paradigm or lens I use to look at the world is not the same today as it was when I was an undergraduate student some 30 plus years ago. In other words, what you might consider to be research depends upon how you'd prefer to work with or being trained to work with questions like, what is disability and how can I learn about it? How should I learn about it, i.e. research ethics? How can I develop information that will help me to know and understand more about disability? Taking this exercise a little bit further, I began to think about ways in which the separation in the program really reflects what I see as a bit of a dilemma. When I look out across the expansive terrain of disability-centered research, I would argue that this space, like many others, is carved up into paradigmatic territories, places that have their own internal consistency, orthodoxy, rigor, language, theory, method, exponents, and gatekeepers, yet perhaps struggle with drift or horizontal flexibility. I also started thinking about some sort of physical metaphor for my thought process and arrived at the fjord, the image you see on your screen, shot in what is called Grossmore National Park. That could be me in the middle. It's also been my PhD students as they've wrestled between sort of positivist and constructivist ethics processes, thinking about the problem of bridge building, positivism, constructivism, impairment, disability, biomedicine, the British social model, plenty of scope for bridge building or swimming around in the troubled waters between the peaks, listening to each other, telling stories, doing research, caring about what we do. Of course, drift and bridge building is not required, and I'm quite happy in my academic work to situate myself within a particular territory most of the time. The practical implication may be that despite the best of intentions, we remain somewhat invisible to one another and have a hard time talking. And I'm not simply referring to individual scholars and or clinicians, or the sort of tensions that can arise in a clinical setting when objectivism and subjective experience meet up. I'm also talking about getting our institutional processes and protocols, i.e. research ethics, for example, working in ways that are paradigmatically flexible, ways that value and understand that there are indeed different, equally valuable ways of approaching similar questions. I consider such things because while much of my interest and passion in the disability studies space relies heavily on subjectivity and interpretation, and my interest in the why sorts of questions, for example, why is this place like this? Will this place always be like this? How are we going to solve this problem? In my everyday life, I'm constantly moving between paradigms, dancing between some focus on what some might call impairment, visits to a clinic, and then the disabling experiences produced by environments and institutions founded on ableist assumptions and principles. I'm certainly relieved that my positivist friends have invented tools that my daughter uses every day, like non-invasive ventilation, pulse oximeters, power wheelchairs, and wheelchair lifts, the biomedical equipment that enables my daughter to make choices about her life, her activities, and her everyday mobility. Thank you, physics, material sciences, engineering, PT, OT, and so on. At the same time, however, I'm concerned about the ways in which rights, human rights that assign access can wither into failed systems, policies, and protocols falling short of producing equal treatment and functional accessibility. I can't let go of or disregard the reality of a clinical diagnosis, what my daughter's body can do, what we might need in terms of intervention to enable her to do what she wants to do, because her disease process is there every day. But I can trouble how and why and to what purpose we engage with biomedicine in regard to my daughter's everyday life. I can say no, enough is enough. We can say no, and so can she. And we can also say yes. So I want to spend some time today telling stories about the disabling experiences of and with places. Places produced and governed by institutions, places used and sometimes staffed by people who work for these institutions, places that produce, for me, three questions really. Will this place always be like this? Why is this place like this? And how am I or are we going to solve this problem? I'm going to focus on stories about everyday life and childhood disability and stories about some of the research I've been involved in with my wonderful graduate students, University of Toronto, in geography and planning. Research largely motivated by my experience as an ally, parent, scholar, and client of Bloorview, amongst other places. So on your screen, you see a piece of word art populated with phrases that Asha uses to describe herself. So before we go further then, I just want to talk briefly about language matters in theory. Here I center Asha, a 10-year-old in this conversation. Through this talk, I use identity first language, i.e. disabled person. I didn't make this choice. It's not mine to make. Asha made it for me. She refers to herself as disabled. She rarely uses the phrase person with a disability or what is known as person first language. She doesn't know or presently care about academic discourse in this matter of language, identity, ontology, and disability. but she and we do feel the impact of language when it works against us or does harm. In this latter case, I'm referring to language shared between bodies, for example, staring or interpersonal ableism, the absence of supportive or symbolic language in our environment. For example, the built form is inaccessible. There's no signage indicating we belong, or institutionalized, or the outcome or product of institutionalized ableism. Or thankfully, the rarefied case of verbal abuse and ableist microaggression. For example, years ago, someone came up to us and was asking questions about Asha's chair situation and so on, and made the statement, "At least she's pretty." You can imagine how that made everyone feel at the time. So what are the ontological implications of how Asha describes herself? Does my or our use of language in this way indicate a preference for the British social model, a sociology of impairment? Is this biomedical? How do we deal with the relationship between disability and impairment, their interactions? What about the World Health Organization and its ICF? Rest easy, as we can save these ontological debates for another day. My objective here is to center everyday life and childhood disability in our conversation, to make visible and to foreground disability and lived experience, sending much of the conversation about theory into the background for now. Moving on, to be clear, these are not Asha's stories. These are stories that involve Asha, but told through the lens or lenses used by her parent to help him understand her experience in the world and his experience as a parent. My telling of these stories makes you part of the story too. When we agreed to share this moment, we entered into a relationship. To this end, Arthur Frank's writing about stories and illness narratives has been helpful in my thinking. In his article, The Standpoint of the Storyteller, he writes, "People tell stories to reaffirm, possibly to create, and possibly to redirect the relationship within which the story is told. Put more strongly, stories as acts of telling are relationships. One person may be speaking, but stories are told with, not only to, listeners who are part of the storytelling. Storytelling is the recursive elaboration of the relationship between those sharing the story. Shared memories are made present. Shared futures are projected. Stories reaffirm what people mean to each other and who they are with respect to each other. We are in this together, and we will all get something out of this experience of my telling of these stories today. Notably, different tales emerge depending upon who is at the center. Where I might experience invisible work and inequality, Asha might experience learning, friendship, and excitement, hence the critical need for child-centered disability studies. As I tell, retell, and unpack these stories, I weave them into others from other places and times involving other people, and stories told at other scales. Taking up a sort of pragmatism here, I draw on work we have done using both objective and subjective approaches to think about disability and access experiences. Moving ahead, we will visit parking pads, bathrooms, the problem of becoming mobile, and other people's stories about childhood disability and access to education. So what you see on the screen there are two photos. The one on, I think your left, is our house before an accessibility retrofit, and the one on the right afterwards. The one on the left, you can see changes in elevation in the front yard, different surface textures. Anyone using a mobility aid would probably very easily be able to indicate that this is not a terribly accessible spot. On the right, and it's kind of hard to see, it's tucked in the back here, you can see a wheelchair lift, and everything is at grade. So we've eliminated all of these surface transitions and unified the surface treatments. So how did we get there? So I'm going to tell this story about the parking pad development. The application form for a front yard parking pad does not have a checkbox for disability or accessibility. Of course it doesn't. So what next? How do I make visible our needs as a family with a disabled child within an ableist, bureaucratic, technocratic planning process that does not see us, a family that needs to remake their front yard and make it work for us and for Asha? Incidentally, if you were to visit our street, what you would see in front of most homes is a front yard parking pad. In our case, however, this will begin with a battle between humankind and the natural world. A tree sits on the city side of the front yard planted by a previous occupant. It's not one of the beautiful aging oaks or elms tasked with casting shade across our neighborhood in the heat of summer. It's an aging multi-trunk birch. A professional arborist has said it will likely expire in 5 or more years. Because of the tree, I'll need to begin a political project to organize support for our plan, noting that we can build a parking pad around the tree. I begin by pursuing my case with our local councillor. I'm optimistic. I have studied the politics of our municipal to federal representatives closely. Our councillor is left-leaning, you might even say progressive. Surely they will understand our need to build around the front yard tree to support our very real accessibility requirements. Alas, it's a setup, as it sometimes is, but these are early days in our life with spinal muscular atrophy. I have yet to learn to be programmed to expect to be disappointed by the many institutions and many of the people that work within them. Of course, many folks are entirely alienated from their institution's locus of power and work distant from the decision points. I have, however, been conditioned to expect to be disappointed when we ask for something. And usually that something is something that many others have, but have worked differently or not had to work at all to get. But our work is different, the stakes are higher, and the physical and emotional toll is heavy. The progressive facade withers as I'm asked, can't you just carry her? Meaning, can I just carry her from parking on the street to the front door of our home? Once I gather myself, once the cortisol stops coursing through my body like an out of control roller coaster, I reply, she's not a bag of groceries. She's a person and she's going to grow and it wouldn't even be safe. And what about the winter? And what about the fact that every other week we would be parking on the other side of the street? And this and that and so on. Moving ahead a few steps, I learned that a neighborhood poll will be needed to garner support for our project. However, our needs are different, and the polling process is ableist in advance. The text says nothing of our needs or the motivation for change in design. It simply states that a request has been made, more work is needed. And so I develop Exhibit A, head out into the neighborhood and begin a series of conversations door by door. I carefully explain our story. Nobody asks if we can just carry her. A final step in the process involves a family trip to the local community council. I end up standing before the council, Asha in my arms, slightly bent over due to her emerging and troubling scoliosis and generalized muscle weakness to make our case. We've been backed into a corner, forced to objectify and exploit the body of a disabled child as part of a transactional, ableist city politics and planning process. But we know that a positive outcome will make things perhaps a little easier and safer for us and for her. We have to use her disabled body as evidence to legitimate and validate our dire need for this parking pad. We've been softly coerced into entering the train of intimacy with a group of perfect strangers because we need to make our place accessible. Council is unanimous in its support. To my astonishment and outrage, the councillor who asked if I could carry Asha to the house lays claim to our work, suggesting that she has been working with us for some time on this issue. We are not the first. This is not a new story when considered historically or otherwise. Time and again, examples emerge where disabled people and allies have had to put bodies on display, enter into a one-sided telling of stories stuffed with intimate personal details or textually described in terrific detail, the embodied elements of disability, pathologizing the self or another to garner support, to demonstrate that they are disabled enough to receive the bare minimum in support, often having to do the same work over and again when the text expires, when the process or time is up, or when the work is required again in another context entirely. Consider, for example, the story of Carrie Ryan as retold by disability historian Michael Rembis in a chapter called Challenging the Impairment Disability Divide, Disability History and the Social Model of Disability. War produces injury, death, impairment, disability. In the 1970s, some veterans of the Vietnam War organized to seek reparations and support from industry and governments for children disabled by processes related to parental exposure to dioxin, one of the most lethal substances on Earth, contained within the herbicide Agent Orange, used in the US government's Ecocide project, designed to basically eradicate vegetation from the landscape in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to expose so-called enemy positions. And we tell the story of Carrie Ryan briefly here. Her parents would use objectification and exploitation of their disabled child's body as a tactic before a congressional hearing in 1979, with a view toward forcing chemical companies to compensate families and to make a claim for disability benefits for their daughter who had substantial care requirements. Of course, in no way am I drawing parallels between the relative magnitude or impact of events captured in these stories. For example, there's 4 to 5 generations of children who've been impacted by initial dioxin exposure during the war in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s. However, it is hard for me to ignore the similarities in the embodied elements, the political tactics employed within these examples of parent-ally disability justice projects separated by more than 4 decades in an international border, projects carefully crafted to generate reasonable support. Dare I say, a charitable response from government or disability from government for disabled people. Community council, congressional hearings, parking pads to Agent Orange. What's old is new, what's new is old. Families, allies forced to paradoxically work with and use medicalized, pathologized, sympathetic, charity-based discourse that we often reject in everyday life with a view to pushing institutions toward releasing the necessary resources to make places work better for us and our children. Moving on to the problem with bathrooms. And some of the text here today will feature in an article that I've written with my graduate student, Rhonda Solomon, which will come out in the Journal of Planning Theory and Practice sometime this year. So how did we get here? Kneeling close, and this is not a picture of us. This is from an article in The Guardian, I think, Guardian. How did we get here? Kneeling close to the floor, gently and carefully placing my daughter's body gently and carefully placing my daughter's body sorry, something came in on the chat and it threw me off. My daughter's body onto a beach towel we brought with us, again, because we have learned through repeat exposure to unimaginably produced, broken and ableist design and infrastructure to expect to have to change her on the dirty floor of a public bathroom when we venture out into the city. Leaving the house with our disabled child has become a mind-bending logistical puzzle, and venturing out into the world an act of resistance. We resist the temptation to simply disappear, to avoid the rows of staring eyes. We resist the temptation to simply give in to the exhaustion of resisting and the unseen labor of trying to reimagine, rework, and make work public infrastructure designed and installed without having us in mind. Why is it that washrooms, bathrooms seem to have largely escaped acts of thoughtful, inclusive design and installation? Is it simply that we can't cope with our leaky bodies? Indeed, a lack of universally accessible public washrooms often leaves disabled people and their caregivers, if they need or want one, exposed to degrading and dehumanizing away from home toileting experiences. In some cities, even able bodies are finding it increasingly difficult to leak in the public realm because quasi-public washrooms are becoming increasingly securitized spaces, and the pandemic has made it worse. Many of you will undoubtedly have observed stalls with wider doors, hand railings around a potentially lowered bowl, and so on, symbolic gestures to the possibility of accessible bathrooms. These elements of design fit within a rather limited idea about what disabled bodies do, what disabled people want and need, and how they want to and can move. They also tend to ignore the scaling up of bodies via technology, i.e. the chair body assemblage. I need more space because you're accommodating me and my chair, which is also me. And so even when somebody tries to get it right, the end result is often performatively accessible, but functionally inaccessible or unworkable in the broadest sense. I can't help but wonder if planners, institutions, and the designers of public toilets should do some serious thinking about the issues behind what Tanya Tchaikovsky calls careless caring, a gesture to the act of caring, such as placing an icon of access on a door, or installing an accessible washroom that meets minimum requirements, yet screams of an unimaginative Cartesian way of thinking about disability. Boyce too writes about care, public care, the moments that act to support diverse bodies as we go about our ordinary lives, from door handles to handrails to places to sit to public facilities. Careless caring, with intent or otherwise, when scattered across our cities, ultimately produces a failure in public care. Token compliance with code and the production of accessible public toilets fails to support the everyday lives of disabled people. So, what would a public toilet look like if it was designed from the start with disability in mind? If we could take greater care in our public care? Perhaps changing places toilets offer a way forward. These toilets are intentionally designed and installed with all bodies in mind and the multitude of ways that bodies leak. To be precise, not all bodies leak standing up in a square meter or less of space. However, even these places designed with the best of intentions might unintentionally fall short of the goal. Reflecting on the status quo, however, when a child or adult is placed on a dirty restroom floor to be changed, what does this say about us as a society? That some people deserve to experience the indignity and humiliation of lying in other people's filth, that they literally are physically beneath a neoliberal able-bodied other, too insignificant and unimportant to be toileted at the same level. What are we saying when someone intentionally dehydrates themselves simply because they want to use the city in the ways others do? Why has it become okay in the general imagination for disabled othered bodies to be degraded and harmed in these ways? Why do only certain leaky bodies matter? In the end, I really see perhaps a mixture of certain possibilities. The status quo, i.e. taking on several possible individualized relational responses, basically the sort of actions I've described here, like never leaving home, if you do leave, hoping you don't have to go, holding it, intentional dehydration, caregiver support in unworkable places, and even a urostomy, remaking your body to make it work in unworkable places through surgical intervention. While I respect the agency of people who decide to do this because it may liberate one from some of the ableist failings of our built environments or because it's needed for other reasons, I find it hard to process intellectually and emotionally that one must consider reconfiguring their body's interior to compensate for society's failings. Another possibility is environmental change, reimagining the bathroom and organizing the necessary political and material resources to make and remake bathrooms work for disabled people. Moving on from this sort of academic processing or distillation of lived experience toward another aspect of my work, it took me several years post Asha's diagnosis to get to a place where I was able and willing to bring experiences like these into my research practice. Why is that? Perhaps I was just waiting for Asha to teach me enough so that I might feel that I have something to say. All of these experiences with Asha leading up to and including the moments I've described today are what motivates my work. As we move through the remainder of the talk, I bring us into contact with other people's stories and work we've published about education access and school travel. All of this work was done before COVID. And so as you can imagine, I have an entirely different talk to write about the near total institutional disregard for disabled lives during the pandemic globally. Anyway, to get to school, to operationalize access, you have to move, either your physical body somehow, or as the pandemic has taught us, by pushing bits of information through the electronic ether. But even then, online education is a corporeal experience. So how do we make access, accessibility, mobility, and independent mobility happen? And I'm just going to pause for a moment for just an organizational note. I guess we sort of ran a bit longer, and so I don't really want to stop the talk to take a Q&A at the end. I'd rather use that time to get through the entire keynote. And so I will put my email at the end of the presentation. And I would really strongly encourage folks to reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to have a conversation, set up a Zoom meeting, answer questions by email. So, I suppose there's a question that should come before. What are access, accessibility, and mobility, independent or otherwise? For our sake today, let's just move forward with the following. Access can mean one is permitted entry. Access is often codified in rights. It's not the same as accessibility, which focuses more on the sort of resistance in space, time, and the environment through the social that individuals experience in or when attempting to gain access. Most of us will equate mobility with movement or motion, which is fine for our purposes. Back to my original question, but with a twist. How do we make it possible for Asha to realize her desire to move independently? How do we make it possible for her to access the threshold of a school that she has a right to access with equal treatment? What all of this thinking amounted to originally was simply a long list of materials, people, institutions, governments, environment, systems, transactions with Asha at its center. What you have in front of you is a diagram I created to communicate the network of bodies, materials, institutions assembled to produce access, accessibility, and mobility in relation to a single activity, Asha moving independently 1 millimeter in a power wheelchair, or Asha becoming mobile. Put another way, each slice of the pie is a relationship, one that involves care work, our work, unpaid labor, our labor. Time has been erased here. Some of these people and things we no longer work with, but at some point in time, they were involved in a process that has made access and mobility possible. This is a nascent, relatively pragmatic exercise at this point. I'm merely diagramming the entities and materials that make possible a daily trip that many take for granted, the journey to school. My intention is to draw attention towards the volume of invisible work produced by ours and many other families' need to engage with a network of people, places, technologies, institutions, and materials with a view to realizing access, eliminating or at least attenuating barriers and making mobility possible. My mind is somewhat unsettled in this project. The work is unfinished, but I can tell you I've been reading Barbara Gibson's writing and a recent piece by my colleagues, Sue Ruddick, Lindsay Stevens, and Patricia McKeever. Their work looks back on and takes up the works of Deleuze. In my list, for example, we have an assemblage of people, technologies, materials, and institutions that we have had a role in organizing and applying towards Asha's mobility project. Think about it. Asha becomes mobile through an extensive local to global network of labor, technology, institutions, and materials. The entire project is quite astonishing when considered in this way. And don't worry, I'm not going to dive into each one of these articles in detail. Moving on to other people's stories, work we have published on school travel experiences of other families. I briefly touch on two matters, the journey to school itself and some work we've done on busing. In Tim Ross's dissertation work, a qualitative study on school travel, we worked with 13 GTHA, Greater Toronto and Hamilton area families recruited through a hospital clinic. The children we worked with had a clinical diagnosis of SMA, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or osteogenesis imperfecta, often requiring mobility support of some kind for school travel. The work involved the use of photo voice and semi-structured interviews to get at the school travel experiences of children and families. Focusing on one of the more remarkable findings here, and one that really mirrors my experience, I'd like to briefly dig into some of our data about arriving early and leaving late. Disabled children temporarily located and living within the liminal space between here and there, school and home, home and school. Parents reported problems with dropping students off and the formulation of ad hoc accommodation by schools to overcome a school site's inaccessible parking designs. Come late, arrive ridiculously early, park far away, you're on your own. I became particularly interested, however, in the problem, and I should say none of what we learned was terribly surprising, in the problem of early dismissal. Ash, for example, already misses class time and loses opportunity for peer interaction due to health issues. She's actually at a clinic today, and routine and unexpected medical appointments. What if she and other children are missing classroom time because of a transport scheduling problem? It sounds completely absurd. Our work confirmed what I already knew, however. One of the parents reported that children regularly end their school days early, stating that they even bring out my two children early to avoid hallway problems. Okay, so how early is that? And the parents had 15 minutes. So they bring them out 15 minutes early. Yeah, 3 o'clock, they bring them out, and the dismissal time is 3:15. So leaving class 15 minutes early each day to avoid crowded hallways mean that the children could lose up to 75 minutes of classroom time per week, or 47 and a half hours per 190-day school year. Whether it's arriving late or leaving early, it appears that negotiating disabled children's classroom time is favored as a solution over addressing a transport scheduling problem. What if we scaled this up to all disabled children using buses? If disabled students could attend a closer school, perhaps less time would be lost to liminal spaces. I wondered how much extra time or distance do disabled students spend on buses when compared with a scenario where they can access their closest grade match neighborhood school. This question became the focus of the third study, actually done in partnership with the TDSB. While I don't have time here to dig into methods, we found that on average, some disabled children spent 80% or more time and distance being bused than they would do if they could attend the closest possible school. In other words, the bus trips are 80% longer than they need to be if every school was accessible. And this varied depending upon the sort of clinical ministry labeling of children's bodies. There's plenty of opportunity then built into these long trips and the getting ready to go and to leave for students to lose classroom and social contact time. Paradoxically then, and this is not the same thing as saying, oh, I'm somehow not pleased that we have access to such services because they don't exist in other places. So the challenge is to do a better job in providing these services in the first place. So paradoxically then, when a service designed to facilitate inclusion and access fails to do so, or does not go quite far enough, it can actually end up producing the very thing it was intended to address in the first place, namely a disabling or limiting experience or loss of some kind. Importantly, it is not the responsibility of families to demonstrate undue hardship in a case like this. When accommodation is requested, if, for example, I demand that my daughter not be released from school early to solve a board's bus scheduling problem or the driver's problem or the operator's problem, it is incumbent upon the board to demonstrate that this request presents as undue hardship. It is not my responsibility or the responsibility of other parents to solve these problems. It is my responsibility to notice the problem, document it, and ask for it to be fixed. So moving on to the last bit here. As part of my invitation, I was asked to offer some thoughts on fostering healthier futures for all youth families living with disability. Experiencing disability does not mean you're unhealthy. So health and disability are not antithetical. For example, most of the time, Masha is very healthy while SMA takes over in the background. I've sort of come to focus, however, on several issues or opportunities for intervention, including several that don't need further description because they're so obvious. Basic income supplement or support, correct the exhausting double and triple work produced through care silos and the duplication of resources, and making our education systems actually accessible. However, I want to focus my remaining comments on two matters: homeschool care and disability justice. Stating the obvious, more resources are needed to support the home and school care settings. EAs, PSWs, RNs, RPMs, backups to the backup plan, funded and managed. Don't make us do the work. See, for example, the fall issue of the Ontario Medical Review. There you'll find an article, The Human Cost of Living Without Home Care. The profiled family pointed to several problems that are quite familiar to us. Last-minute cancellation. Incidentally, last night at 8:51 p.m., I received a call from our nursing agency indicating that the nurse was ill and would not be able to come, which caused us considerable scrambling to try to put in place temporary support. And I was quite astonished, really, because this talk today was probably the most important thing on my intellectual calendar for the semester. And it was just perfect that this happened the night before I was giving it. No shows, going for weeks without finding support, no supply of support workers, time pressures, impacts on employment, the unsustainable qualities of their circumstances, and the physical and emotional toll of care work, precarious employment and job loss, never building trust because we've been conditioned to expect people to leave, and so on. At the time of writing, we've gone several weeks without steady, reliable additional support at home to help make a more steady, predictable schedule a reality. This is stressful. Literally painfully so. We regularly reinvent, repopulate what I like to call Asha's constellation of care. As people come and go, as some people let us down entirely, like planets drifting out of orbit. This is not new to us or to many other families who rely on home care supports. There's a home care crisis. The pandemic made it worse. So I'm really parroting here what doctors are already advocating for. The OMA is advocating for better home care services to improve public health and the lives of people in the community. Just fix it, make it a priority and fix it. Lastly, when thinking through the question of how to foster healthier futures for all our families and youth living with disability, I'd like to suggest we place greater emphasis on particularly oppressed disabled people within the all. Disability justice is an intersectional way of thinking about and working with within the context of disability studies, advocacy, and so on. This means thinking about disability and ableism as they relate to other forms of identity-focused oppression, i.e. race, gender, sexuality. The framework was developed in San Francisco in 2005 by the Disability Justice Collective, Black, Brown, queer, and trans people. Principal architects included Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, and Stacey Milburn. While the DJ movement is a non-academic political project, I do see connections with the work of scholars like Fiona Kumari Campbell, Fiona Mula, Sean Gretsch, and Raywin Connell, who've been writing about intersections between critical race theory and disability studies, the historical and contemporary disabling effects of colonialism, and disability in the global South. One way I think about disability justice is in the context of the systemic discrimination experienced by Indigenous peoples in healthcare and education in this country, historically and otherwise. Well, there are several examples to draw on. For example, please consider reading about Brian Sinclair. I focus my remarks today on the story of Noah Buffalo Jackson and his family. Noah's mother, Caroline, fought basically an 11-year battle, complete with all imaginable and unimaginable sorts of stress, injury, and loss, secure funding for Noah's transport to school. Noah and his family are from the Montana Cree Nation and live in Treaty 6 territory, aka Alberta. Part of their battle included trying to secure funding under Jordan's principle, federal legislation that is meant to ensure that the institutional first point of contact will cover costs, with any sort of recovery occurring later. It's intended to reduce jurisdictional or institutional barriers to service provision. At the time, the narrow definition used to define who is eligible for support basically disqualified Noah and his family. He was not considered disabled enough. He did not have sufficient complex needs and multiple caregivers, for example. This is a common problem, not unlike Asha and the parking pad, or Asha and her EA support, or Asha and the assistive devices program and her chair, or Asha and home care support. The list goes on and on and on. Here, disabled people or their caregivers have to make the case that you are more disabled than you are, or disabled enough for support. The case often requires descending into a medicalized normative discourse about disability, where once again, one is forced to exploit, objectify, and pathologize the self or someone they care for to get support. Stop making us do extra work. It's like we are forced to agonizingly engage in a dehumanizing spectacle to trigger the release of necessary and still typically hardly adequate resources. Not only am I disabled, I must assume the burden of proof in demonstrating that I'm literally super disabled with a view to receiving the paltry offerings of the state. Caroline Buffalo's fight included, and if I sound frustrated, obviously I am. So this is academic and it's also quite personal, of course. Caroline Buffalo's fight included a 2013 human rights complaint centered on racism and disability, i.e. disability justice, against the federal government, and was eventually settled around 2017. The details of which are irrelevant to my point here, which is that she should never have had to fight in the first place. In contrast, as Asha returned to in-person school this year, within about 24 hours of starting to ask questions, I had the Transport Consortia, the school principal, and a board planner working to solve our problem. Racism, disability, ableism, preventable loss, education access and exclusion, stress, work, care work, our work. Recently, a federal court dismissed an application for a judicial review of a landmark human rights tribunal compensation order for First Nations children, leaving the federal government responsible for billions of dollars in compensation related to the child welfare system. At the time of writing, some headlines read that the government was engaged in what I would argue is a sort of racist humming and hawing about whether or not to fight the Indigenous child welfare ruling. And with that, I'll conclude my keynote today. And I want to thank you very much for your time. Sorry if I went a little bit over.
Thank you, Ron, for opening both our minds and our hearts this morning through your storytelling. And thank you for challenging us to think more deeply about ableist designs of our environment and the heartbreaking and oppressive consequences that they cause. Clearly, so much still needs to be done. I want to thank you, Ron, for taking the time to be with us this morning and sharing your story, Asha's story. You've certainly provoked a lot of reflection for me personally, but I think as for all of us as a research institute in all of our research. And it's really so fitting that you served as our Mickey Milner keynote today, because you've truly imbued the spirit of Dr. Milner in bringing together science, the lived experience, and issues of social justice. And thank you, lastly, for being available after the talk to address questions from our research community. What an amazing way to kick off our research symposium.